From Lost to Loved. The Tale of Ginger, the cat who found love twice. Once upon a time, in a small, charming village surrounded by rolling hills and green meadows, there lived an elderly woman named Mrs. Parker. Her home was a cozy little cottage with a garden full of flowers that bloomed brightly in the spring and a fireplace that crackled warmly in the winter. Mrs. Parker lived a quiet and peaceful life, but it hadn't always been that way. Many years ago, she had shared her home with her husband, but he had passed away, leaving her alone. Though she had friends in the village, her days often felt long and lonely, especially during the rainy months. One such rainy afternoon, while Mrs. Parker was on her way home from the market, carrying her basket of groceries, she heard a soft, pitiful sound. It was the faint cry of a kitten, barely audible over the patter of raindrops. Mrs. Parker's heart ached as she looked around, her eyes scanning the street for the source of the sound. There, huddled beneath an old bench, was a tiny ginger kitten, soaking wet, his fur matted down by the rain. Without a second thought, Mrs. Parker knelt down, gently scooped the kitten into her arms, and held him close to keep him warm. The kitten trembled in her hands, too weak to resist, but too grateful to run. "You poor thing," she whispered softly. "You must be freezing." When they arrived at her cottage, Mrs. Parker dried the little kitten with a soft towel, placed him in front of the fire, and offered him a small dish of milk. The kitten hesitated at first, but hunger soon went out, and he drank eagerly. As the kitten warmed up and his belly filled, he started to purr, a low, rumbling sound that filled the room with comfort. From that day forward, the little ginger kitten, whom Mrs. Parker decided to name Ginger, became a permanent part of her life. Ginger quickly grew into a lively, slender cat with bright amber eyes and a playful spirit. He would chase after anything that moved, whether it was a leaf blown by the wind, a string Mrs. Parker dangled for him, or even his own tail. In the garden, he would leap after butterflies, dart through the flowers, and climb the old oak tree that stood proudly at the center of the yard. Ginger's energy and joy brought light to Mrs. Parker's life, filling her lonely home with laughter. Every morning, he would wake her by gently pawing at her face, demanding breakfast and attention. And every evening, when the sun set and the fire was lit, Ginger would curl up on Mrs. Parker's lap, purring contentedly as she stroked his soft fur. They were the perfect pair, an old woman and her loyal, lively cat. Years passed, and as Mrs. Parker grew older, her body began to slow down. Her steps became more hesitant, and it became harder for her to move around like she used to. She could no longer chase Ginger in the garden or toss toys for him to catch. Ginger noticed the changes too. He no longer ran as much or explored as eagerly. Without the daily activity that kept him fit and lean, Ginger began to gain weight. His once slender frame became round, and his playful energy faded. He spent more and more time lounging in sunny spots or curled up in front of the fireplace, content to doze the day away. Though Ginger was still devoted to Mrs. Parker, there was an air of sadness in their home. Mrs. Parker's health continued to decline, and eventually, her family made the difficult decision to move her into a nursing home where she could receive the care she needed. On the day Mrs. Parker left her cottage, tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks as she kissed Ginger on the head for the last time. "Be a good boy, Ginger," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll always love you." Ginger watched as his beloved owner was taken away, his heart aching with confusion and loss. He didn't understand why she was leaving, and he didn't know when or if he would ever see her again. With Mrs. Parker gone, Ginger was taken to a local animal shelter. The shelter was a noisy place, full of barking dogs and meowing cats, all waiting for a new home. Ginger was given his own small cage, where he was provided food, water, and a soft blanket to lie on. But despite the kindness of the shelter workers, Ginger felt completely lost. His heart was heavy with sorrow, and he missed Mrs. Parker's gentle touch and the warmth of their little home. At the shelter, Ginger withdrew into himself. He didn't interact with the other cats, nor did he show any interest in the toys or treats the workers offered him. Most of the time, he lay curled up in his cage, facing the wall, unwilling to meet the gaze of anyone who passed by. When potential adopters came to the shelter, they glanced at him briefly but quickly moved on to the younger, more playful cats that meowed for attention and batted at their fingers through the bars of their cages. Ginger remained silent, his once bright eyes dull with sadness. As the days turned into weeks, Ginger began to lose hope. He was no longer the lively cat who chased butterflies in the garden. Now, he was simply an old, overweight cat that no one seemed to want. He missed Mrs. Parker terribly and couldn't imagine life with anyone else. But one bright morning, everything changed. A little girl named Lucy walked into the shelter with her parents. Lucy was no more than 8 years old, with bright blue eyes and a heart full of love. She had been begging her parents for a pet for months, and today, they had finally agreed to visit the shelter. Lucy wandered past the rows of cages, her eyes scanning the cats, kittens, and puppies, all vying for attention. As she walked, something made her pause in front of Ginger's cage. While the other cats were playful and noisy, Ginger sat quietly, his back turned to the world. Yet there was something about the way he sat there, so still and sad, that tugged at Lucy's heart. "Mom, Dad," Lucy called, pointing to Ginger. "I want this one." Her parents exchanged surprised looks. "Are you sure, sweetie?" her mother asked gently. "He looks like he's a bit older, and he doesn't seem very playful." But Lucy's mind was made up. "I don't care if he's old," she said firmly. "He looks like he needs love." Lucy's parents couldn't argue with that. The shelter staff explained that Ginger had recently lost his elderly owner and had been struggling to adjust. They warned Lucy that he might not be as energetic or affectionate as other cats, but Lucy wasn't discouraged. She insisted on taking him home. When Ginger arrived at Lucy's house, he was cautious and uncertain. The house was filled with unfamiliar smells and sounds, and though Lucy tried to be kind and gentle, Ginger kept his distance. He stayed mostly in one corner of the living room, watching Lucy from afar with wary eyes. He didn't trust her yet, afraid that if he opened his heart again, he might only lose someone else he loved. But Lucy was patient. Every day, she would sit quietly near Ginger, offering him treats and speaking to him in a soft, comforting voice. She never forced him to come closer, but simply let him know that she was there for him whenever he was ready. Slowly, something began to change in Ginger. As he watched Lucy, he started to notice a familiar look in her eyes, a look of warmth, kindness, and love that reminded him of Mrs. Parker. Little by little, his fear and sadness began to melt away. One evening, as Lucy sat reading a book, Ginger finally gathered the courage to approach her. He softly nudged her hand with his head, and Lucy's face lit up with joy. From that moment on, Ginger's heart began to heal. He started playing again, chasing after small toys that Lucy tossed for him and exploring the corners of his new home. As he moved more and ate better, his body became healthier, and soon he returned to his normal weight. But more importantly, his spirit was light again. With Lucy's love and patience, Ginger learned to trust and open his heart once more. In Lucy, Ginger had found the same unconditional love and care that Mrs. Parker had once given him. He realized that, though he had lost one family, life had given him another, a second chance at happiness. And so, Ginger lived the rest of his days in peace and joy, by the side of the little girl who had seen the love and kindness in him when no one else had. Together, They discovered that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that there is always room in the heart for a new beginning.